In the winter of 1934, a paralyzing terror gripped the rugged hills of southeastern France. Farmers locked their doors before sunset. Shepherds refused to tend their flocks alone. Travelers avoided isolated roads whenever possible. Across the Var region, people whispered about a phantom lurking in the countryside. No one knew who he was, no one knew where he lived, and no one knew who would be next. For years, police searched for a phantom hiding in plain sight. When they finally discovered who was behind the murders, the truth was more disturbing than anyone imagined. This wasn't a crazed drifter wandering the wilderness. This was a man who had slowly abandoned the rules of civilized society, until he no longer saw a difference between hunting animals and hunting people. The nightmare began as a whisper 4 years earlier, in 1930. Residents of the small French commune of Fléasque were stunned when a local shoemaker named Joseph Rameau was found murdered outside his business. Police launched an extensive investigation, interviewing witnesses and searching for suspects, but nothing came of it. The case went cold. At the time, investigators believed it was an isolated tragedy. 4 years later, the phantom truly emerged from the woods, and the killings accelerated with terrifying speed. On March 4, 1934, horticulturist Marius Vassal stopped to rest beneath an oak tree in the countryside. He never made it home. When authorities discovered his body, they found clear evidence of robbery. 100 francs had disappeared. Over the following months, the attacks turned into a blitz. An elderly man returning home with groceries. A shepherd finishing his day's work. A chauffeur driving alone through the countryside. One after another, victims were ambushed, shot at close range with heavy buckshot, and robbed. As autumn arrived, fear spread across the region like wildfire. Farmers carried weapons while working in their fields, and every stranger became a suspect. Yet despite countless interviews and patrols, police had almost nothing to work with. The killer struck quickly, left no witnesses, and after every attack, he seemed to disappear into the wilderness itself. Months passed, and the investigation stalled. Then, a breakthrough came from pure chance. On December 7, 1934, 2 gendarmes were conducting a routine patrol near the railway line connecting Les Arcs and Vidauban. As they moved along the tracks, they spotted a disheveled man emerging from the nearby brush carrying a hunting rifle. Something immediately felt off. The man appeared nervous, defensive, and uneasy. The officers approached and requested his hunting license. He didn't have one. An armed poacher wasn't exactly unusual in rural France during the 1930s, but as the officers searched his belongings, the atmosphere turned to ice. Inside his coat was a silver pocket watch. When investigators checked the serial number, it matched perfectly. The watch belonged to the murdered shepherd, Félicien Rouvier. Suddenly, the phantom was in custody. Under intense questioning, the man finally gave his name, Giuseppe Cecia, an Italian immigrant. He began to crack, describing how he watched the shepherd's routine, learned his movements, and waited until darkness provided the perfect opportunity to strike. The confession horrified investigators, not just because of what he had done, but because of how casually he described it. But the final proof was waiting at his residence. When police searched Cecia's isolated stone shack hidden away in a field, they discovered his trophies. Hidden inside were wallets, watches, and personal belongings connected to multiple victims, including items belonging to the missing chauffeur, Jeannie Galliano. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Cecia confessed to the string of rural murders. Only one crime he refused to admit, the 1930 murder of the shoemaker, Joseph Ramo. Even so, investigators remained convinced he was the one who started it all. The question now became, who was Giuseppe Cecia? And how had he transformed into one of France's most feared killers? The answer wasn't what many expected. Cecia had not always lived as a recluse. After arriving in France as a child in 1896, he built a respectable life. He farmed land, flipped property for massive profits, and even owned a restaurant. For years, he appeared to be a productive member of society. Then, everything collapsed. A combination of severe financial losses and poor decisions left him nearly penniless by 1933. His businesses failed, his savings disappeared, and his relationships deteriorated. Gradually, he withdrew from society altogether. He moved into a deteriorating stone house isolated from the surrounding communities, surviving only through poaching. The wilderness became his world, and somewhere along the way, his view of human life began to warp. On November 5, 1935, Giuseppe Cecia stood trial in Draguignan. More than 500 spectators packed the courtroom, desperate to see the face behind the nightmare. Reports noted that Cecia appeared less like a criminal mastermind and more like a cornered animal. But the forensic evidence against him was devastating, dismantling his claims of self-defense. The most powerful moment came when the state medical examiner testified. The doctor argued that Cecia was not insane. Instead, years of living as an isolated poacher had fundamentally altered how he viewed other people. In the examiner's opinion, Cecia had become so accustomed to hunting animals that he eventually began treating human beings as prey. It was a chilling conclusion. Not because it suggested madness, but because it suggested something far more unsettling: choice. The jury needed little time to reach a verdict. Giuseppe Cecia was found guilty and sentenced to death. On February 17, 1936, shortly after 6 o'clock in the morning, the heavy doors of Draguignan prison opened onto La Rue Public Street. A silent crowd waited outside. For years, fear had stalked the forests, farms, and lonely roads of southern France. People had wondered whether the killer would ever be caught, or if the attacks would ever stop. Now, the hunt was over. The man who had spent years stalking human beings through the countryside was led to the guillotine. On that cold winter morning, the phantom of the woods vanished forever. But nearly a century later, the story of the shepherd killer remains one of France's most chilling reminders of how an ordinary man can slowly transform into a predator hiding in plain sight.